This video was recorded in front of a live studio audience at Stanford University.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about tests because I think they're preventing us from doing some interesting things in education and in instruction. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can make them better with computers. So here's the outline. I'm going to start with problems with current tests. And the reason I want to talk about them, again, is that you can't change the learning until you change the tests. Right? So the MCAT is finally changing because of this problem. They started to realize that the MCAT was sort of selecting and leading to certain kinds of learning and instruction that isn't actually what they wanted for doctors. And so they finally started to change that. So these tests are very important. They influence what people think matters the most. Right? So they shape national and local policy. They shape instruction and teacher practices, and they shape what students think counts as useful learning. And so there's sort of this little thing in the background that we don't pay attention to because we don't actually know who makes the tests. They just show up, but they do a lot to shape us. And so current tests send the wrong message about what counts as useful learning. So I need to prove this to you, so I will do so. Here is this is a California standard for US history, 11th grade. So very thoughtful people put together standards for what students should learn. And somewhere along the line, these standards get sort of farmed out to assessment makers, and they make test items. And those test items determine lots of stuff. So here's the standard. I will let you read this. So this good standard. If people knew this would be quite satisfying. So your task is to predict the question that kids see for this standard. You'll never do it, so I won't. So down at the bottom is the standard. Here's part of the question, right? And then here's the question they have to answer. So somehow they sort of lost the intent of the standard. So just to drive it home a little more, you have to predict the standard. I'll give you the test item. So here's which of these organisms would most likely be found at the top of the energy pyramid. I don't know why I always have an urge to say clams. But that is not, I believe that is not correct. So your task is to decide what does the standard look like. And so there it is at the bottom, and here's the standard. So the standards are well intended. They capture important things, and then the assessments are something completely different. Right? And so the first issue here is that most tests measure a thin slice of learning outcomes that we might care about. So if we ignore the absurdity of those items, because I picked really absurd items, there's familiar issues with tests like this. There's this overemphasis on unaided retrieval of facts and skills. It's just you, your pencil, and the bubble that you fill in, or you, the computer terminal, and you just have to remember stuff. That's sort of the task. And so this is a way to emphasize routine efficiency. You're supposed to be fast, you're supposed to be efficient, you're supposed to have low variability. That's what most tests measure, like the SAT, that's what that is, right? And you get it right. And this is sort of why people make mistakes as well. So these kinds of tests are useful for when you are going to go into highly stable performance environments where you know exactly what it's going to be and efficiency always works. So for example, word decoding. We practice word decoding in very stable environments because the words are always left to right. There's always spaces between them, whether it's on my cell phone, a poster, a paper. So you want people to be fast. You don't want them to be figuring it out each time. Another example of a highly stable environment is gymnasts. And so they practice to a high degree of efficiency on very stable equipment. I don't know if any of you saw the Olympics, the Summer Olympics a few years back, but there's this period where all the women were wiping out on the vault, right? They had developed this high degree of efficiency for a very specific environment, and the vault turned out to be, someone set it a ½ inch too low. And they're just all wiping out. Right? So high efficiency is good, not if the environment changes. This is where you start to get blinded by your assumptions. You start to believe things, and you don't see what's new. And so this is relevant to the opening task you did. So what we probably care about more is adaptability, people to let go of their assumptions, to learn new things, to continue growing and to change. Some things you want high efficiency, but there's not a lot of them. So let me give a thought experiment where the usual tests might lead to a misdiagnosis. So I have two candidates applying for a job. I have Bob, who took a 5-week course in Excel spreadsheet software. And I have Mike, who does not know Excel, but he taught himself 3 other spreadsheet programs. The company uses Excel. So they give a test on Excel. And he sits down with Excel. And the result, as you would expect, would be Bob would do better, because sort of Bob learned the exact commands that you're supposed to use in Excel. But that's probably not who you want to hire, right? Because 6 months later, Mike is going to be the one who's going to do the best, because he already shows that he can continue learning, adapting, he understands the principles of spreadsheets. So this is kind of a general story, that these aptitude tests, they predict about 9% of job performance immediately after training, and then it drops to 4%, and then it completely disappears. Right? So something about our tests aren't actually capturing what matters the most. Let me give you one more example before I give you an alternative model for assessment. So you may have seen this. Every couple of years, there's some reporters who see Harvard students at a graduation or Stanford, and they're a little tipsy maybe, and they got their mortarboard, and they say, "So, Mr. Graduate, so why do the seasons change?" And the Harvard student says something like, "Well, because the Earth's closer to the sun, or because it's cloudy, is that why?" And the reporter, quite smug about the whole thing, sort of implies that a Harvard education is no better than a high school diploma, right? Well, that's sort of what our tests are like. How do you fix that? Well, you give them a day to learn the answer. Who's going to do better, right? Suddenly, you're going to see all the things that the Harvard student can bring to bear, all the education that they've had that has prepared them. So this other kind of assessment is a dynamic assessment. And the idea is, as part of the test, you give people a chance to learn during the test. And you see, can they learn what you're giving them right then and there? And so this turns out to be a very sensitive kind of measure. So this is an alternative to the usual kind of test. Okay, so the second issue is that people use tests to define what counts as useful learning. One is the tests are a bad measure. The second is people use those measures to decide what they think is important. And so they send the wrong message to students about useful learning. As a teacher, I can tell the students, you got to stick with it, try lots of different things, be exploratory, be creative. But then the test comes back, and that trumps whatever I may have told them, because that is the evidence of what I consider most important. And students would be stupid not to pay attention to the grades on the test, because that is the evidence that's available to them. So instructional formats then start to follow the tests, and this is sort of the problem I'm worried about most, is that you get a certain kind of test in organic chemistry, and what's the instruction look like? It's preparing you for that test. So we took over a section in physics here at Stanford, and we taught them in a new way that actually led to much better outcomes, and we know this. And the student response was, the problems you're giving us are not the problems that are going to show up on the test. I don't want to do these. I want to do the word problems like they look on the test. Right? Of course. They'd be stupid not to do that. So here's an interesting graph. This is from the TIMSS. This is an international study that gives the same test to lots and lots of nations to see, so we can rank ourselves, because people like to do that. And over here, what we're doing is we're plotting the average science score. So everybody likes to know, here's the United States, so we're at about 550. And so the interesting thing about this graph is this other axis. This is the percent of students in the country who have a positive attitude towards science. So the better your nation is doing on this test, the less you like science. Right? And that's a pretty good correlation. Right? And so I think there's a lot of interpretations that you might have of this, but the one I like is the reason these students are doing the best on this test is because they're being prepared for that test. They see what that's like, and they don't like it. That's not what they want to do, right? They want to be scientists. So I think something about preparing people for these tests gives them a bad idea of what it is they're supposed to be, what it really would be like. Okay, so here's the world's falling apart. Now in come computers. So what can we do with computers to help fix this? Well, option one is we can measure the wrong thing only faster and at scale, right? So a good example of this is adaptive testing. Adaptive testing may not be what you think it is. It's basically a way for the test to find out sort of where you rank on 100 points faster. So you're taking this test, and if you get the answer right, it'll give you a harder one. You get the answer wrong, you may, if you've ever done this, you may have had this kind of response to it. You know, it just gave you an easier problem. You know you just got the last one wrong, right? And the test is trying to calibrate to where you are. So one of my favorite psychometricians, these are people who study how you make the mathematics of good tests, has this to say, and I'm assuming everybody can read this, and so I don't need to read it out loud. But if that's wrong, let me know. So the important part of this is that computerized testing is a mechanical horse. It's testing, all it's doing is it's going faster a little and it's a lot more expensive, right? So it's basically, if I were to take a cheap shot at MOOCs, it's sort of doing what MOOCs are doing. Oh, look, we can get the worst kind of instruction known to man to go to scale. Excellent. Not this MOOC. Okay, so option two is to use computers to gather what was impossible before, but matters a lot. So what matters a lot? So I talk with a lot of school principals and superintendents, and I sort of tell them what I am. And I ask them what I can do for them. And I used to think they would tell me, can you help our kids do better on the standardized tests? Because there's a lot riding on that, like funding formulas. And their answer is always the same. It is, can you help our students be more adaptive and make good choices as they go through and continue to learn in life? And it's a very consistent theme. And you also sort of see this in these new 21st century competencies that are showing up. You know, things like grit, persistence, collaboration, or in informal learning, autonomous, when nobody's telling you what to do, right? The main concern in all these is that people are making the right choices about what to do. Should I stick with it? Should I quit? Right? Am I choosing the right things to work on? So given this, it seems to me what matters is choices that improve learning. And this is what we should be assessing, are the kinds of choices people make about their learning. And so computers are kind of key for this because they can create this rich interactive learning environment so I can see, do people learn? Are they prepared to learn? And do they make the right choices to do that? And computers collect lots of data. So I get all the data on the backside. So here's what we've been doing about it. We're making these little game-based assessments that measure student choices. And they're 10 to 15-minute games called choicelets. And they capture typical performance, not maximal performance. So most tests are capturing you at your very strongest effort. And what I really want to know is, what do you like most of the time when you're doing your learning, not when you're all geared up for a test. And so there's things to learn in these games, but you don't have to. You can level up without learning them. And so it's sort of there for you. And we can sort of see, are you prepared to learn by making the right choices about these kinds of resources to learn about? And so we track their choices. And ideally, we can demonstrate that some choices are better for learning, that we can demonstrate these choices can be measured. And finally, we can test whether we can teach students to make better choices about their learning. So let me give you an example of one. This is called Posterlet. You are on the organizing committee for the school fun fair, and your job is to make posters for booths. And so the first thing you do is you choose a booth. You then design your poster. There's then a focus group who looks at your poster. You get to choose 3 people from that, 3 animals from the focus group, and you get to choose feedback that either says, I don't like, or feedback that says, I like. But you can only choose one of the 2 for each character. You read your feedback. If you'd like to revise, you can. Then you submit your poster, and you get to see how many tickets you sold, and you do this 2 more times. So let me show this concretely. I don't quite know how to make my mouse show up, but maybe you can. Yeah, thank you. So this is me. I've chosen the basketball toss, and I'm going to make a very bad poster. Everybody chooses the lion. So now you see it says, I don't like or I like, and I get to choose one. And the information I get from I don't like and I like is equally informative. And I chose not to revise. I submit my poster. I sold one ticket. And now I can make 2 more posters. So the key moment in this game is, do they choose I don't like or I like for the feedback? This is the critical choice, and this is what we're measuring. So there's 3 posters total. There's 9 chances to choose positive or negative feedback, and I get 3 chances to revise. Each poster I can revise just once. All the feedback's informative, so we wrote a little intelligent system that looks at the posters and evaluates them by 21 graphic design principles. We're not measuring artistic quality. It's things like, can I read your text? Right? Do you have a picture in there? And so there's the positive feedback, which says things like, good, your font is big enough to read. And there's the negative feedback that says, it's hard to read the small letters. So negative here means constructive. It doesn't mean punishment. But the literature indicates that negative feedback is better for learning, but nobody likes it, right? Because they take the negative feedback as an ego threat. It's about me as opposed to being about their poster. And so that's kind of a problem that people have. And so we wanted to see, does seeking negative feedback tell us anything important, right? Which may be difficult for some people to do. And all the prior work on feedback has imposed it. It's called supervised learning, where someone else is giving you feedback. Here, it's up to them what they want to choose. So is choosing negative feedback important? We asked 450 middle school kids to play. And the major goal of this first study is just to validate the assessment. So for these choice-based assessments, we run into this tough problem, which is that with most tests, accuracy is objective. So if you give the answer 5, I know you're wrong. Right? If you give it 4, it's you're right. But when I say, choosing negative feedback is right, you might argue with me and say, you can't prove that. Right? So I have to go out and prove that certain choices are better than others. So that's what we did here. We went to demonstrate that some choices are better than others. And so is choosing negative feedback the right choice for learning? So what we have here is the results. So negative feedback, again, they got 9 chances to choose between positive and negative feedback. So the more negative feedback they choose, the less positive they're getting. Right? They only get 9. So we can look at how much their posters improve over time. And it turns out the more negative feedback you choose, the more your poster increases. So this number is called a correlation. And it basically, a big number means 2 things are really tightly associated, and a really small number means they're not. Right? So this is a pretty good association for this. We also give them a post-test afterwards about graphic design principles, like don't put the text too close to the edge, which is one of the things the game's taught. And we see again, here you see revision also improve poster quality. This makes sense because they're making a better poster by revising it. On the post-test of the graphic design principles, again, we see negative feedback correlates. We see revision goes down, but it's still correlating. So basically these 2 things, if you engage in this, it predicts that you will learn more from this game. Turns out negative feedback and revision are correlated. So, is it that kids who like negative feedback are also kids who like revision? Or is the negative feedback triggers revision? I don't know. So here's the second part. The choice of negative feedback in the game correlates with learning in school. So we have a sample, subsample of these kids. We got their achievement tests. So in New York, they have their own test and their own standards, and the negative feedback is correlating pretty well with it. So this little game is predicting 16% of the variance in kids' math scores in New York, if that makes sense to you. Chicago uses a different set of standards and a different test, but those kids, they show the same level of correlation. So this choice to seek negative feedback seems to be important. Revision, not so much. It bounces around, right? So it's kind of less reliable. So the take home here is, stated another way, the more that you seek positive feedback, the less you're going to learn in the game and in school. So you're not going to find that out another way than this. So summary, choosing more negative feedback is better for learning within the game, and it's associated with academic achievement. There's a bunch of issues. Maybe there's something deeper that causes the correlation between negative feedback and learning. You know, maybe it's personality, it's IQ. You know, same things are there. Maybe it's something you can't change, and so these are issues that we need to go study. But my view of this is that learning choices are strategies. And a lot of the things that you think are personality traits are actually strategies. So we have this tendency to view broad-based cognitive skills as traits, like IQ. We tend to think of IQ as a property of a person. IQ is a score you got on a test. That's all it is. It's like me saying you got a 23 on a spelling test. But IQ, suddenly it becomes the person. Right? So take the example of a creative person. You think some people are creative, some are not. You may even go to like the D school here and get trained in how to be creative, and you may think, I am a more creative person. That's the wrong attribution, right? Really what you've done is you've learned a set of strategies that help you become more creative. So walking, we've shown that walking improves your creativity almost twofold. We did another study where if you have people generate ideas in parallel, they're much more creative, they get more clicks on the web, everything's good. You know, another thing is you should treat tasks as low stakes. If they're high stakes, you won't be creative because you're too worried and you want to take the safe route. So creativity is a choice. It's a choice to use these strategies. It's not a trait. Right? And so I think that's true for things like choosing negative feedback, for being adaptive, and so forth. So we assume that learning choices are also strategies and they can be taught. So we conducted a study to find out. So hang on, this one's complicated. So this is the way it worked. This was like the hardest thing I've ever done. We took over a middle school, 6th grade, and taught 12 classes for 4 weeks. And what we did is we did sort of design thinking, because it goes after these dispositions, fail early, fail often kinds of stuff. And everybody went through these simplified design cycles. And so the first one was 2 weeks in math, and they made like design pig houses and nets. I don't know why pig houses, but that's what they wanted. Nets, I understand, this is where you sort of, you make sort of cutouts and then they fold up into a box. So that made sense to me. Then we did 1 week in social studies where we designed a unit where they had to design a fair way to make decisions, a process for making decisions. Sort of perfect for 6th graders. And then finally, we had them make an ecosystem board game that the board game had to show that organisms sort of, you lose energy as things move up the food chain. And so there were 2 groups. We split these 12 into 2 sets of 6 classes. And so one got parallel design. And what they were told is you try many things and look across them. So if you're making these nets like this, you make a bunch of them, and then you sort of look through and see what's working and what's not. So it's a very design thinking strategy. And across these different things, they got to do this 5 times. So out of 4 weeks, we actually only got about an hour and a half of getting our treatment in. Right? It's the price for doing business with schools. The other condition was stakeholder design. Here, their job was to go get social feedback. Right? And so they would make their net, their instructions for how to make the net, and they would give it to somebody else. And then they would see how the other person used it, and the other person would give them feedback on how they're doing. And then and so they got that 5 times. So everything's exactly the same except for these 5 time points. And afterwards, we give them 2 assessments. One is the one I just showed you about seeking negative feedback, and one is called Photolit, and I need to show that to you briefly. So in Photolit, you are a cub reporter, and the animals have escaped from the zoo, and they've gone to all sorts of ironic places, like there's porcupines at the balloon shop. And your job is to go take photos of them, and you take photos and you have these settings. Like you can set the focus, the shutter speed, the aperture, things like that. You can get some resources to how these things work if you want. You can take all your photos and sort through them and sort of see what's working. Then you submit your photo, you get feedback, and then you do it again. So here's a quick video of what this looks like. So these are sort of the different tabs that you have. So these are monkeys in the convenience store. Your task is take a photo of the monkeys fighting for the banana. So it's kind of blurry, so maybe you change the lens setting. Then you've taken some photos, and you can take as many as you want. And you go to this page, and you can sort of look at your photos close up. And you can sort them. You can sort them by hand, like this. Or there's a drop-down that allows you to sort them by which one has the best focus, or how was the lens set. Here's the animation. So this sort of is trying to teach them a little bit about how the camera works. We ran out of time. There was supposed to be some text on the side to sort of explain what's going on, but we didn't have time to do it, so I don't know how much people learned. You then choose your photo, you submit it, and Chuckles gives you 5 bananas. He likes that the focus is on the right target. And then you go on and you do this for several rounds. And so the first round, you've got monkeys at the convenience store. Second round, you've got penguins serving drinks to polar bears. And in this round, your camera has a shutter speed, so you can control that along with focus. The next round, there's rhinoceroses in the china shop, and here you get to control the f-stop. And then finally, you have all 3 controls for the porcupines. Okay, so both kids take both of these, right? The prediction would be, you would think, the people who did the stakeholder design are the ones that we taught, go get social feedback. So we expect them to get choose more negative feedback in the poster-lit one. These kids were taught parallel designs, try many things, look across them. So we would expect them to sort of do better on this, where they would try more settings, take more photos with different kinds of settings. So that's the prediction. And so there's one last thing to note. This school tracks math. So there's the double advanced math, there's the advanced math, and then there's the regular math. And if you're in advanced math, you stay with those kids through social studies, through science, just because of the difficulties of scheduling. Okay, get ready. So remember, stakeholder condition, seek feedback. Parallel condition, make lots and examine. So here are the poster-lit results. These are the kids in the parallel condition. So we didn't teach them to seek feedback. What you can see is that the regular math students choose negative feedback about 3 times, and the double advanced choose negative feedback about 6 times. So this is the same kind of result as I showed you before. In fact, the correlation here about how much they choose negative feedback and their standardized California tests are about the same level as you saw earlier when I talked about New York and Chicago. So this just replicates what I've shown you before. Now the other condition, they're the ones we taught to seek negative feedback. And the question is, what's going to happen? So it looks like this. That it is the low achieving kids who learned it. The high achieving kids already had it. So now we can cross over to the photo-let. So here, I'm representing how many different camera settings did they try. So in this case, the kids who were told to seek feedback are now the control condition, right? Because we never taught them to sort and try lots of things. So again, choosing lots of camera settings is correlating with standardized achievement tests, and you can see it just by how it's laying out with the grades. Question is, the kids we taught to seek lots of stuff, what do? You know, to try things out. Did we have an effect on them? Same story. Right? We moved the low achieving kids. Right? So I'll leave this up for a second. It's a lot of data points to digest. So interpretations, the simplest is we can measure these choices. The computer made it fun for the kids, a lot of work for us, but it made it tractable for us because we could collect this data. We couldn't do it another way. The choices appear to matter for learning and they can be taught. And there seems to be a reason to teach the choices, and now there's a way to know if we're succeeding. So you hear a lot about teach design thinking, but they have no way of finding out is that good or not. Now we do. And you have a way to compare different curriculum. So there's the irony of the high achiever result. So when you go into these schools, the teachers all say the same thing. They say, these high achieving kids, they're the ones who need to learn these new kinds of design thinking skills because they're so worried about getting the right answer on the test. They don't want to get wrong. Turns out they know. They know to try lots of stuff. They know to seek negative feedback. The problem is it's the environment they're in. Right? They'd be stupid to do that when getting the right answer is how they got there. So they already know these skills. The problem isn't with the kids. The problem is with the classrooms. Then there's this other question, which is why don't the low achievers know or use these strategies? So I'm guessing you can generate a lot of interesting hypotheses. I won't bother. Good question, though, is now that we've taught these low achievers to do better, will their standardized achievement tests go up? Be sort of a miracle result, but I'm hopeful. So we made some other of these. Choice to organize information. This one would be good for doctors on the way. Basically, you have to replace the vet and diagnose dogs who come in. And we look to see, do you bother to organize your information, or do you just flip through prior patients? Turns out this is a really good predictor. Choice to engage in critical thinking. So people often get confused about critical thinking. Critical thinking is how do you decide what to believe? Most tests are hypothetico-deductive, sort of like you'd imagine the LSAT is. But in here, what we did is we just measured, are you willing to engage in critical thinking? Turns out that's a really good predictor of how people are doing in school. Choice to abandon after failure. If you fail, do you choose to do something else or do you stick with it? So this is pretty typical kind of persistence measure. Choice to inquire, or do you just want to get the right answer? Choice to read. These are fun to make. So in conclusion, teaching of the test. Why do people consider this to be a bad thing? One reason is because I might only teach a small sample of the material that I can cover on the test, right? Because the test can only be so long, so I just sample stuff that I taught. If I taught to the test, I might only teach that sample of stuff. So that's one honest complaint about it. Another one is we appreciate the tests don't measure what we really care about. Right? And so, but what if the test asks people to learn something new during the test when given a set of resources and choices for how to use them? If we just change our test format. We would probably, as teachers, teach the students the most important concepts plus the strategies that prepare them to learn. We wouldn't teach them all the edge cases and all the tiny things because they can look that up. Right? In this case, teaching the test could be a good thing. So, thank you.